Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to day 2 of the African Feminist Book Worlds, as hosted by the Center for Women and Gender Studies, together with the Saatchi Chair for African Feminist Imaginations. This program seeks to celebrate feminist heritage with a series of book discussions on a selection of recent African feminist books. This forms part of the ongoing archival work of the African women's histories, stories, and experiences done by the Center for Women and Gender Studies, together with the Saatchi Chair for African Feminist Imaginations. However, my name is Yandisa Sive-Jubase, and I work at the Center for Women and Gender Studies as a research assistant. But today I will be your facilitator, and you will be seeing more of my face in between the exciting program. But before we get started, Wendy, can you please just put up the program so we can have it on? And I'm now going to call upon my colleague who also works as a research assistant at the Center for Women and Gender Studies, Nomta Menye. Nomta, can you please just come in and do the official opening and welcoming for us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jubase. I call it Trupsi. A very good afternoon to everyone present today. As mentioned, my name is Nomta Menye. I form part of the Center for Women and Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University. I would like to greet and welcome everyone to the day 2 of the African Feminist Book Worlds. I would like to welcome our director, Dr. Babola Makotwana, who was present here today. I would also like to welcome Prof. Pumla Dinawakola, the head of Saatchi Chair in African Feminist Imaginations. I would like to welcome the management of the Nelson Mandela University, our community partners, and our wonderful feminist authors who participated yesterday and those that are joining us today. Finally, I would also like to welcome everyone who took time away from their busy schedules to join us today. This is also to welcome everyone who's joining us on our social media pages such as YouTube. As mentioned, this is day 2 of the program. Yesterday, we were graced with authors such as Ulihle Ngcobozi, who was the author of Mothers of the Nation, Manyane Women in South Africa. She was in conversation with Prof. Dinawakola. Soon after that, we had Prof. Desiree Lewis and Prof. Baduroon, editors of Surfacing on Being Black and Feminists in South Africa. They were in conversation with Gail Smith, and in a closing conversation, we had Dr. Atambila Masola, the author of Ilifa, and she was in conversation with Aphiwe Nhlemeza. As you can imagine, colleagues, these books provided a cutting-edge conversation touching on motherhood, feminism, race, language, spirituality, Dibala Ndonina. But if you did miss it, it is available on our YouTube page. Today's program promises to be nothing short of that energy. Therefore, please do not hold back. Galo mazwi nditi namkelekile. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nom, for that vibrant and excellent welcome. I do believe sonke sizawukhululile ibhatyi sizive samkelekile in today's program. Well, we are going to get started with what we've come here to do, which is to think through some of the exciting African feminist work that has been published and that we have the honor to have all the authors in our midst today. And but before we get started, I'm just going to start with introducing Prof. Dinali Gaga, who is going to be the first author who will be in conversation with Prof. Paula. Prof. Dinali Gaga is an associate professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. She has published in the areas of gender, digital media, and popular culture, with a focus on radio drama, tabloid newspapers, and social media cultures in Kenya. Her book, Women, Visibility and Morality in Kenyan Popular Media 2020, speaks to issues of gender, violence, and popular culture. She is also the co-author of Radio in Africa, publics, cultures, and communities, and rethinking Eastern African literary and intellectual landscapes. Prof. Dinali Gaga, welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, and of course she'll be in conversation with Prof. Phumla Dineo-Qola, who is a professor of literary and cultural studies and the NMU DSI NRF Saatchi Chain African Feminist Imagination. She has previously been a professor of African literature at the University of Witwatersrand, senior lecturer in the Department of English and Classical Culture at the University of Free State, and chief research specialist in the Society's Culture and Identities Research Program of the Human Science Research Council. A graduate of the University of Cape Town and Warwick in the United Kingdom. She also holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Post-Colonial Studies from the University of Munich, LMU in Germany. Qola is the author of groundbreaking study on slave memory in South Africa. What is slavery to me? Post-colonial slave memory in post-apartheid South Africa, and the landmark Rape, a South African Nightmare, which won the 2016 Sunday Times Alan Paton Award for nonfiction. Her other books are A Renegade called Simpiwe and Reflecting Rogue Inside the Mind of a Feminist. Most recently, she released Miriam Tlali, Writing Freedom with HSRSC Press, an introductory text on the pioneering of Black South African feminist novelist, short story writer and essayist Miriam Masoli Tlali, and recently Female Fear Factory with MF Books in Southern Africa. Welcome, Prof. Qola.
Thank you, Drupsi. Good afternoon, friends, colleagues, and everyone joining us on this Zoom, as well as on our university YouTube page. I am absolutely beside myself with excitement that I get to talk to Professor Dinali Gaga, the amazing Professor Dinali Gaga, on her latest book that I am completely obsessed with, and have been completely obsessed with since it came out. Hello, Dina.
Hi, Phumla.
So you know by now that I'm obsessed with your book. I had a conversation with Dina about her book. But for those of you who are not in Nairobi, who are not in Eldoret, Kenya with us a few weeks ago, I'd just like to show you what has been happening, the kind of complicated, full-on relationship I have with Dina's latest book. Mind you, I mean, my copies of her earlier books are also a little bit like that, but we won't be talking about them too much. So let's get to it, Dina. You know, we're just at the end of,
Okay.
Can I ask the first question? Can I ask the first question, Dina?
Oh, okay. All right.
You can, sorry. So did you want to say something? I'm just
No.
excited.
I'm just trying to figure out how we're going to do this.
I have no idea.
Yes.
But you know, I have like a million things to talk to you about your own book. So I'll just start. You know, we've just come out of so we're doing these 2 days, which I just, we're also excited about here at the Center for Women and Gender Studies at Mandela. And we've just come out of a 3-day postgraduate workshop on African feminism with our students, Dr. Babalama Kokwanas, my own, and our colleagues and collaborators, Dr. Spokas Magadla at Rhodes in Politics and International Relations, Professor Zethu Matebeni, the Saatchi Chair in Sexualities, Genders and Queer Studies at the University of Fort Hare, and Dr. Atambile Masola from Historical Studies at UCT. And one of the set readings was your book for one of the sessions. And one of the things that came out quite clearly as our postgrads, both masters and PhDs, were engaging with a variety of topics in their presentations, was how they felt in many ways that even though they were from different places but located in the South African Academy, so many of the insights, so many of the examples, so many of the histories, so many of your treatment of a whole range of media and public texts and commonsensical kind of understandings about women and publicness felt and sounded so familiar. So a few of them said, I mean, we know it says in Kenyan popular media, but it really feels like Professor Ligaga's written it could just as easily say in South African popular, South African popular media. And as they were talking about some of the examples, some of the figures that you use, they were saying, oh my goodness, this is like the same thing happened. It's sort of similar. It makes me think of this, what happened, the public event around this politician, or the public event around this media personality, or this scandal about this woman. Now, you, of course, are an academic who straddles both the Eastern African and Southern African academies and kind of so surely, I mean, who works in both those spaces, although you're located in Southern Africa institutionally. I want to start by asking you, I know you've probably heard this a million times and you're bored of it, but for our purposes, can you reflect a little bit on what that sounds like it means for you? I mean, to write a very Kenyan text that people are saying sounds like a very South African and very Zimbabwean text or study.
Oh, okay. So I'll start by just thanking you and thanking all of you who have invited me to this wonderful event. I'm very happy to be part of it. And thank you, Pumla, for seeing me and seeing my work. It's one of those that can easily disappear in the literature, so thank you so much. I'm excited, of course, because I get to sit and think with everyone present today and discuss issues around feminist thought and imagination locally and globally. And so I just wanted to just say thank you for that. And I'm also, also very excited to talk about your book, which I'm so much more excited to talk about than my book. But just to come back to the question you're asking, I think as an author, when you're writing about a topic that is interesting to you and that you kind of have a sense of its context, you feel the urge to locate it. And so my writing of this work was based on the Kenyan public sphere because I know it and I lived it and I understand exactly what is going on when I talk about some of the things that I talk about, and I'll get to that in a minute. So I'm always, I think I'm always very aware of the ways in which context shapes both theoretical and methodological choices. And so this is part of why it is based in Kenya. However, as I was writing, I was also very aware of how some of the things that I talk about, actually nearly all of the things that I talk about, are things that travel. And you express that very well in your book, which I'm hoping you're going to come back to. Almost the kind of universality of some of these things, not because they're good things, but because they are, right? Because of the systems in which we come to. So I hear what your students were saying, and I hear what it means to be able to identify the themes in the book, but also to identify the kind of theoretical positions that I take as things that are common as things that are generative in that way. And so, yeah, the short part of my answer would be that. And hopefully I get a chance to speak more widely about what it is that I was doing with the book.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll ask a follow-up question.
Okay.
Sorry, we didn't discuss beforehand how we were going to do this. And it's the first one where it's people who want to talk about two books talking to each other. So all the other, I think it's the odd one in the 2-day program. So now I'm thinking perhaps I should have initiated that conversation. But let me ask my follow-up question, and then I'll stop hogging you temporarily. So one of the things there are so many things about this book that animate me intellectually and aesthetically. But one of the things I absolutely love about this book is as you said, part of how it speaks unapologetically to the Kenyan context, but also is able to reach well beyond that. Some societies and areas of the world that are very similar. So there are very particular resonances to those parts of the continent and the world that were kind of, I imagine, that were kind of settler, that have because it's a contemporary study, but it's also a historical study. It's a study of how ideas, and it's a theorization of how these structures and these logics emerge and evolve and shift and their patterns, whatever their patterns are, of eruption, of repetition, of mutating and so on, work across very different epochs that we very often as academics study in isolation. We often say, well, this has historical precedence. But you do a painstaking, like a really, really kind of detailed, nuanced, deep tracing of the histories of how women come to occupy visibility and or publicness. Why is this historic? Because I know that you are also a scholar of East African intellectual histories. I know that you're a scholar and you've got, you have a book on this. I know that you're a scholar of particular forms of media. Your PhD was on radio drama. So of course, and it speaks to those projects as well. I know that you're a scholar of contemporary forms of media, social and otherwise. But why was it important for you in this book, Women, Visibility and Morality in Kenyan Popular Media, for you to do this historical tracing of how women occupy visibility or occupy publicness and both? Why was that so important?
Wow, Pumla, you hit me with the more difficult questions. So just to kind of give everyone a sense of what it is that I was working on in this book, or that this book entails. It is a book, as you say, it is a book about questions of visibility, of gendered bodies, and it draws from context. So it's very important that the context shaped the way in which the book grew. And what was important to me, in terms of just answering your question, what was important to me was to not just say, this thing is happening. So one of the initial moments of encounter for me was when I began to think about what I was seeing as a pattern of representation, very annoying pattern, where I'd venture into online tabloid newspapers, and the first thing or second thing you see, or every second thing you see, something about how either why are Kenyan women not getting married, or how to get a sugar dad. They're all very they feel trivial. And there was also the process of trivialization. Now, to come out and say, oh, this is the pattern that I'm seeing coming out of Kenyan newspapers and I don't like it, isn't enough. It wasn't enough for me, at least. I needed to kind of understand what was going on. So the writing of the book was also about me understanding what it is that had generated this comfortable place of talking about women in certain spaces. So it's not, as someone once reminded me, it's not all women. Of course it's not. Because if say you're reporting on something that a state official who happens to also be a woman, if you happen to talk about them, you'll talk about them in a different way, okay? Because of course it's either the mode in which you're speaking about the woman, but also the space. However, if you look at specific spaces, whether it's tabloids or on social media, there was always this potential for excess, this potential to draw out things about this woman that had been prescripted to read these women. And so I needed to understand what was going on there. And this was more an exercise, as I say in my preface, it was an exercise of finding out for me, as much as it was about writing about this thing that was irritating to me. So as I've already explained, I then located it within popular culture specifically because popular culture is this field that's filled with conflicted agendas. This is where the everyday collides with larger hegemonic ideologies. But it's also a fluid space. It's a space that allows for me to do so much else. So then it became this space that made it possible for me to trace the cultures of violence that accompany ways in which women are represented in the quote unquote trivial spaces, so trivialized spaces. Because I believe, as Stuart Hall says somewhere else and others who theorize about the popular space, I believe that those spaces of trivialization is where some truths lie. And so beginning from the space of the trivial, of the everyday, generates for me, is very generative for me. And I remember, this is one of those arguments that have been made over and over, of course, by scholars of popular culture. And so for me, the Kenyan history then became this canvas. The historical space became the canvas for tracing. But it also influenced my choices of texts that I was interested in. So I looked at radio drama, which, as you rightfully remember, was what my PhD was on. But radio drama is also located within an institution. And I look at radio drama that's located within state broadcasting. So because of that, I use it as a way in which I reach into history to look at what I call the pattern of representation. So within radio drama, it's very melodramatic. It's about good girls and bad girls. It's about good women and bad women. It's about, very, very didactic, but also very, very, it's divided. It's very, the ways in which the characters are presented to us is either good or bad, so you can see the purposes of this radio drama, but it also allowed me to enter into that colonial space where radio emerges from, and to work with that, to look at the ways in which these patterns emerge and are reproduced in institutions. And then I looked at tabloids because tabloids are just messy spaces. They're both generative, but they're also very violent spaces in the ways in which the stereotypes are reproduced. And then social media for me was my special place because it's the space in which I was able to hear what people say and kind of, I was also able to hear the kinds of prejudices that people bring into reading women who choose to make themselves visible. But I was also interested in the women who make these choices to be visible in spite of. And so locating my women subjects in these three broad areas allowed me to do something with that in terms of just tracing, interrogating ideologies, gender and sexual ideologies, but also offering me a space for interrogating and creating or seeing the ways in which new meaning are being created. So yeah, a very long-winded way of answering your question, but that's it. Yeah.
No, not long-winded at all. I mean, I thought that that's it. That's incredibly rich. I mean, there's so many places to go with that. But I'm going to hold my questions. I did promise that I would temporarily stop hogging. So I'm gonna keep to my word.
Okay. All right. So I suppose then one of the ways in which then I can begin to speak about both the work that I'm doing, well, the work that I did now that the project is finished, I better believe that, and getting into reading your book, I think I started to think in various ways about the work that I did and the work that you have done with Female Fear Factory. One of the big questions for me was the project of naming systems of violence, because for me, this is a connection between the two books, that there is something powerful about being able to name and identify systems of violence. But there's also another project that is happening here, and that is about imagining new sites of freedom. And you know, just to kind of give again a sense of what it is that I do with my book, I think, so to give examples, I'll say, for instance, the first example is, I think of a media story about a woman who defaults on a hotel bill, and think about how she enters into public discourse as an object of violation of the norm. All right. So if you look at the first, the way in which I start my book, I speak about this woman, and she's a spectacle because, oops, she defaulted on a hotel bill. Why is she a story? Why is she trending on social media, right? And this entry for me was a violent entry, right? She enters into this space, and it's a violent space where she then is, she as a symbol, if I read her symbolically, is attracting all this violence towards her, right? However, what happens if the woman resists the name calling and the media framings that force her to fit into the stereotype of a wayward woman? And I'm being very well behaved in my identifying of her as a wayward woman. And instead, what if she challenges the media and she challenges public commentators to pause and recognize her as a woman who can speak? What kind of disruption is happening here? So these are the kinds of things that were interesting to me. If scandal is the space where women are shamed, what happens if one of the people who is in the media, who's a pet subject for tabloid magazines, what happens if she takes that same form, turns it around, and uses it as her site of visibility? So the book is about that. It's about identifying those kinds of things. And so, as you can probably figure out by now, both your book, Pumla, and mine speak about big questions of gendering of public spaces, questions of violent systems, and questions of freedom. We both enter into critical thinking, into disrupting taken for granted systems of patriarchy that impose on bodies labeled either as female, as is the case in your book, or feminine. So both of them are ideologies that allow for particular bodies to enter into them as already marked, for lack of a better word. And I don't know if you want me to then get into how what I see as a conversation between my book and yours, or do you want to just make a comment? Yeah,
I'm going to make a comment.
Yes.
I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that one of the things that is very clearly I mean, apart from the fact that obviously we read each other's work and we think together and we know each other and we've kind of bothered by the same things and are African feminists and, and so on. I think that it is also possible to have all of those things and still produce work that isn't necessarily in conversation, right? So it's not, I don't know if it's automatic. We know lots of other people that we do things with that are writing on other things. But I do think that one of the preoccupations in both our books, both our most recent books, and of course, the connections with our previous books, but I'm just going to talk about those two. Is I like what you're saying about the importance of naming systems, because I think for both you and I, yes, of course, it's important to name things. There's a long tradition of making this argument that it's important to name things, especially in the realm of power. And it's just like analytically important to name things, to be able to speak about them, to be able to understand them, or to be able to theorize them. But I think in our cases as well, one of the things that we are particularly concerned with is the way in which many ideas that are in the public realm, and like you say, taken for granted, that taken a commonsensical, and that are very often presented as recent, as new, and are frantically discussed, are in fact much more interesting than they initially appear. And I think for these two projects come from very similar senses of dissatisfaction for both of us. We're both dissatisfied with the easy, oh, this is new, and so we'll respond to it so there'll be a quick response to a quick new thing. So I think both of us are just generally irritated by the easy, quick response. And so we the curiosity that we invest in these projects is about, well, okay, I want to name it, but part of naming it is part of understanding it, but naming it is actually also paying attention to its patterns, right? Paying attention to emergence, right? Not just to repetitions, to emergence. So it's not, and I think I started by asking you that question that I battle with as well, because I sometimes I don't always think I'm doing things that are historical, but I don't think I know how not to try to answer questions about things that are playing themselves out in this time in spectacular ways, in ways that don't also attend to multiple other archives, right? And I think the other thing that I think that's part of why the historical, because it's we are both scholars of the contemporary, but we're also scholars of
history,
of coloniality. Actually, okay. We are, we spend so much time. So I think that we also deeply concerned with the history of ideas. Right? So how do these things become? How do these ways of thinking? I mean, for you, quite explicitly, as a scholar of kind of literary and cultural histories, and kind of So I think that's one of the big conversations that these texts have methodologically and structurally, and I think in terms of the investment. I think the other one is it is deliberate, but I also think it's inevitable if you work the way I've observed in your work, and that I think I'm starting to see my own work as well. Although I see it much more after reading this book, your book, then I probably would have seen it earlier on. Is this, I mean, everybody talks about interdisciplinarity. And I think that, I mean, we're trained in very specific disciplines, right? and we share some disciplinary, we share a significant part of disciplinary training and the ways in which we're differently trained as well in our earlier academic training. But it seems to me also that we almost can't help but look at different cultural sites and different kinds of cultural archives, right? So I think that's, and I don't think it's just interdisciplinarity. I think it's an understanding that those, although we care very deeply about genre, and the capacity to both care very deeply about genre and understand genres as language systems and pay attention to how genres works and what things are made possible in radio drama versus a novel versus a Twitter feed. At the same time, I think this loyalty at some level to reading as though those boundaries of genre are absolutely solid. So that's what I think we share other things, but I think those are the things that kind of strike me as quite important methodologically, structurally, and in terms of how we choose to theorize in these two particular books. I don't know if I've answered you. I've just kind of gone off on a complete crazy tangent, but that's
no. You you raise, I think, the question of method. I think you raise quite important points, especially about our methodological choices. Look, I feel as though your book was a completion of a mission for me. So in other words, I started asking something, and I did not have the language for this something, right? I started asking questions about visibility and violence and linking it to what I call morality as a system, right? But then I think the question of, because remember in my book, I then use the idea of the public script to sort of speak about ways in which women or femininity, let's not say women, but ways in which femininity comes into being. And in many ways that the moment I then get to read Female Fear Factory, I see it. I say, I tell myself, okay, this seems to be what it is that I wanted to say, but I just couldn't quite find the language. There was something about the public, and there was something about visibility, and there was the violence of the system itself that made it possible for me to then see visibility as a site for engagement. So I think you're kind of more, you're very, what's the word? Your reading of the ways in which these two books come into conversation is very generous. I just think my reading of your book makes me see how much more my world would have been made easier had I read your book before I finished mine. Because you name it, you're unapologetic in the way in which you enter into naming the system. You untangle for me this myth called patriarchy by getting into the roots of its mechanization. You question the mechanics of patriarchy that enable it to be a violent system. And for me, I loved encountering this theorization of Female Fear Factory because I felt it gave me a vocabulary with which to engage with this monstrous, overgeneralized idea called patriarchy. So I struggle with that idea in my book precisely because the kinds of texts I deal with often don't lend themselves to be read using complicated language. They are what they are. And so to be able to see that pattern and to be able to map that pattern was a challenge to me. And had I had your book, I had rape, I'd read rape, and the chapter on Female Fear Factory, which of course I cite, but I think it's only in your book that I start to see the way in which I could have found this a lot more useful in framing the idea, the taken for grantedness, or what you call patriarchy's everywhereness, because that's really what my book was about. This is what your book is about. But I think you're taking a much more, what do you call it? You're a much better soldier than I am. Let's put it like that, because you're kind of going through it. Where I try to kind of dress it up and generalize and make it abstract. No, you go for it. And in that way, then your book is so generative, and it allows for so much more kind of what I would call so much more space holding for anyone who wants to work in this field. What the things that we take for granted, to be able to theorize that violence and the way it plays itself out. And I think in thinking about that, one of the things again that jumped at me was the way in which you then think about questions of intervention. Because your book is not just about the naming, it's about the intervention. And this is where I kind of paid particular attention, because I'm always interested in what you have called quite usefully the feminist imagination, because we need to be able to imagine ourselves outside of, instead of always thinking from, instead of always thinking from within a system that is violent or a system that is hurting us. How do we imagine ourselves out of those systems? So I'm constantly looking out for work that does that. And so your work, you know this, I'm obsessed with your work on Brenda Fassie, by the way. And I'm sure you know this, just as much as I'm obsessed with any work that thinks about what freedom means. And sometimes that freedom lives in the space of the imagination until it comes to fruition, until it becomes real. And so for me, these are the things that are, I found particularly interesting with your book, and particularly attractive, if you want. And it reminds me of Patricia McFadden's idea of feminist consciousness, you know, where she encourages us to think about living consciously by refusing to be a part of the dominant thinking about women. I mean, it's, you know, she's a radical feminist, so she, you know, she gets it. She gets the language. And she urges us to constantly question, to come equipped with that critical tool. So I feel that Female Fear Factory gives us that tool to think with, to work with. It's bold enough to kind of reach out to those who will feel threatened, because it's confronting the system. It's starting the work of dismantling that system. And I thought that was for me one of those very powerful moments when I was engaging with this book. So where I'm thinking about, and sorry if I'm running on, just stop me, please. So when I'm thinking about what I do in my book, which is I search for the function of stereotypes of femininity that enable the production of violence in popular culture. So when I do that, you introduce a concept that's bigger and more fitting, that connects concepts of publicness, violence, and socialized behavior. In this way, I find that your book returns to well-known familiar practices that shape, encourage, and sustain patriarchy, while simultaneously shedding light on the ways these practices impact on women's lives. As I was reading your book, a lot of the times I had to stop and say, I know exactly what you're talking about. When you say, when you talk about, you know, the guy, the man who attacks you as you're taking your walk. It happens. I live in a very gentle neighborhood, quote unquote, but I can't take a walk without being aware of my space and who's around it.
Yep.
And you name this thing, you name it. And I think that's one of the biggest contributions that, you know, it's a big contribution to us, for us as feminists. It's a resource for us to think about both, you know, a system, but also think about ways of imagining freedom within that system. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dina. That is so generous. I mean, it's thank you, really, thank you. You say a lot there, and I mean, you're so incredibly, I think in some parts overly kind about the book's strengths, but thank you. I'll take it. I'll relish it and I'll enjoy it. It's interesting because when I started to read your book, and then I was writing Female Fear Factory, and then I stopped, right? So the first read, and then I stopped. And then I said, no, finish, and then it'll be your reward, right? You can finish this fantastic book as your reward. But then I sent the book, and the book went into production, and then I reread it, and I thought, because the thing you say about prescripting, right? I was like, now if you understood that as not as scripts, but if you understand how she spoke about prescripting, it would have been a much better. It would have been, you could have written this book so much better.
Your scripts work. Anyway, your chapter with the script, it works beautifully. No. It works beautifully because these are the scripts.
Yes, but I don't understand prescripting until I'm reading. I'm like, I understand the scripts, the patriarchal scripts, but I don't. There's when I come to your conceptualization, not just of here are the scripts, but how prescripting worked. Then I think it would have been, but I mean, you know what? I'll write another thing, not another bloody book, but another thing. And then I can like develop the Female Fear Factory using prescripting now, the work that I, if I read and finished instead of making it a reward, that I would have known now. And then the second thing, also the ways in which you talk about kind of access, but yes, but I hear what you're saying. So let me talk a little bit about Female Fear Factory then. I mean, I think that for me, I don't think that you having read Female Fear Factory would have necessarily, yes, I think maybe you would have spent more time on violence. But I think that your project is so much bigger than illustrating how these processes work in relation to violence. And while my work has, over 2 books, spent a lot of time, okay, maybe 3, maybe it was the slavery one as well. But anyway, but has spent a lot of time trying to understand the patterns and the systems and name specific things about how seemingly contemporary crises of violence are actually cannot actually be, we're doomed to kind of sit in the same place conceptually, not just kind of materially, if we don't think about these systems, first of all, if we don't think about institutions, if we don't think about logics, and if we don't think about kind of histories of kind of emergence of ideas and so on, so across different epochs, across different eras. I think that, and so of course in Female Fear Factory, that is a big part of the project, to try to understand not just, what I'm concerned with is trying to understand what this thing that I think I name in Rape, a South African Nightmare, and imagine to be a much smaller thing, right? So in Rape, a South African Nightmare, when I come out with Female Fear Factory, I see it, I recognize it, but the project is rape, right? So all the other patriarchal things are only interesting insofar as they're going to help me understand the South African rape crisis and the histories that create that crisis, and why our institutions, the institutions we go to help us with this crisis, cannot help us because they are part of what built this rape crisis, not just rape culture, which is part of it, right? But also like how they make rape a language of a founding and a foundational kind of one of our foundational languages of the South African polity and public. And as many people remind me, not just South African, but I mean, I think like you say, it's wonderful that our work speaks to many temporalities and geographies. But there is something when you really take context seriously and you really want to understand and name something and trace how it develops. It often is absolutely crucial that you fix it. You fix your creation, right? Like you fix as in anchor it in a political geography, right? So, which is not to say that the concepts can't travel, but in order to be able to understand, and of course, I mean, it's also part of a weird thing that haunts those of us who are African, right? Because, I mean, in one sense, when people whose work we study endlessly, like I'm just thinking like Habermas, right? I mean, he's not writing about like, but we understand that he's writing about a very particular small geographical space, but we understand that even though he anchors it very, very clearly in a very particular European nation and country and time, that this is a concept that continues to be engaged across the world, across contexts, across, different revolutions, like physical, material, violent, technological, across very, very different kinds of times. But often, so I think there's something to be said about, even as I said, okay, well, your book is a very Zimbabwean, a very South African book. I think there's something very important about the fact that, well, of course, a Kenyan book is going to speak about the world, right? Not just in terms of the example, but theoretically and conceptually theorize, across the world. But in order to be able to understand and name systems, especially systems, because I think if you're just analyzing phenomena and then you don't really need the historical grounding. I think that's the thing. I think I've answered my first question for both of us.
True.
That's the point, is that we both actually, despite all of your teaching on post-feminism, sometimes in your media classes that I always give you a hard time about, we both actually very old-fashioned types of feminists, in the sense that we care deeply about institution, about the fact that, about structure, about systems. And so it's not enough then to just say, this is a global patriarchal phenomenon. We know it is, but in order to show what the phenomena is, to name the phenomena, we have to do the deep historical work, because otherwise it just becomes a contemporary phenomenon, right? And also then we're not able to think about how to tend to, how to undo, how to amplify the imaginative feminist praxis. We're not able to look at the difficult, unruly, wayward women and the ways in which they undermine these things, the ways in which, and that wonderful, wonderful gift of a chapter where you talk about, where we're able to also kind of deal with the work, with the transgressive and freedom increasing work, even by characters and people we may not necessarily even find easy as feminists, or transgressive, and not necessarily transgressive in ways that we like.
Yeah.
That are easy to like as feminists, right? But to be able to pause and look at and take seriously the ways in which they trouble something that is instructive, and the way in which they trouble, those things are instructive. And also, very importantly, I think for this moment, where very often we, in a feminism and a feminist analysis that's not attentive to systems and structures, that it's so much of a, for me, too quickness to often say, oh, it's transgressive, and all transgressive behavior by women is feminist. And I think that's a dangerous place. I think that's a dangerous place, because I think that it makes everything feminist. It means conservative women disrupting conservative spaces in patriarchal ways become feminist, right? Which isn't, surely feminism can't be everything. And we're not being like the gatekeepers of feminism, but I think it's important, like you say, naming is important, and the systems are important to keep an eye on. And I think also because we also, obviously as feminist scholars and African feminist scholars and people in the world, we also care deeply about not just understanding this phenomenon about how women become visible, and how fear works politically across time in very particular ways, but also across different large, the female fear factory as a particular way in which women, all women, but also others made socially constructed as female, not biologically constructed as female, are also kind of produced in order to produce as female, and then as part of kind of, and then the production of fear as linked to that production as female. But that it's I think it's the important part of what a historicized analysis allows us to do. A historicized and a historic naming allows us to do is to be able to think also about why some feminist strategies and some really wonderful tools aren't doing the work as quickly or so kind of easy to kind of co-opt and so on. So I think that's perhaps part of the larger project. I'm not saying that I do that in my book. I'm not, I think like you, as soon as you finish writing a book, then you start seeing the things that, you start seeing the weakest parts of your book. But I think that I'm going to stop now because I think that I can just keep going on and on and on. I'm going to ask you one quick thing, and then I'm going to read Babalwa's question for you. So the thing, okay, so here, I'm now not asking you something that I really like about your book. I'm going to ask you something that's like really difficult, and I want you to speak because, okay, so morality is a hard one. Like it's a hard one. It's a difficult thing conceptually. And sexualities, of course, and new sexualities, as you say, also very difficult things. And yet you bring them together, right? So I'm just like, oh my God, all of these big, difficult things. And as you were talking about the relationship between women visibility and morality in Kenyan popular media and female fear factory as the books, you also talked a little bit about how you work with morality. So I just want to put that in the conversation, right? So the thing about bring morality, the difficult, I just run away from it, to be honest. You'll notice in every single one of my, I don't even mention the word because I just see a landmine and I don't know what to do with it and I just run away from it. So I was like, oh my God, not only does she deal with it, she put it in the title. Woo, Dina, you're a brave person. And of course, the philosophers in the room know every time I'm asked a question about morality, I don't know what morality is, so I'm just going to ask the other question, answer the other question. And then Baba has much more interesting question. She says, thanks for the conversation. It's generous and illuminating. Dina, can we hear more about the public script for women, especially as it relates to the asexual good women and the implications for Pumla's book?
Hey. Wow. Okay, so I suspect that I might answer some questions and some I might take away, like I'm in a restaurant and I'm taking food away. And if I do that with any of your questions, just know that it comes from a good place. So the question of morality, I'm very amused by that. I think part of it is naivety, right? Like sometimes when you look at a thing and it has huge histories and huge implications, but then you know that this is the thing that kind of helps you make sense of some of the work that you do. And just a very quick small anecdote here. When I launched this book in Abuja, I was sitting next to a different author whose work is on morality, and he's a philosopher. And he deals with questions of ethics. I know. And he deals with questions of ethics and so on. And I remember just sitting there and smiling sheepishly because the way in which I think about morality and the way, of course, that he thinks about morality is very different. So in this case, I used the lead of the text to write. And I just completely refused to feel overwhelmed by it because I needed to write what I needed to write. And if anyone wants to take issue with that, of course, quite welcome to do so. And the reason why I say it's from a place of naivety is that sometimes words become, after a while, words become heavy. And morality is one of those. It's really heavy. I mean, it's philosophy, right? But then there's a way in which it then becomes a kind of a general way of scripting. That was what was most interesting to me. And so I must confess, I just zeroed in on that and stayed there. And I just said, I'm not going to worry about the kind of broader questions of what this word means. And perhaps that's one of the things I still need to work on and work with. And for me, then it was an organizing principle, really. It was a way of organizing my work, especially around ideas of melodrama, but also in terms of just understanding the scripting that works to organize the kind of, the different lives or different spaces that I look at, which in many ways links to something else that you talk about, which is ideas of theory. And I am here declaring that I'm a big believer of being able to generate theory. If Habermas could do it, I can do it, you can do it. How they travel is out of my hands. But context is where we generate theory. A lot of the times we are taught, or rather, the kind of more popular way of thinking about theory is that you import it and then you figure out how it fits. But sometimes that it doesn't work for me. No. And so you figure it out. You figure out how to think about an idea and develop it into this theoretical position that you then take, that allows you to do something. So if somebody sees on my title, morality, it's probably going to either be an odd encounter or whatever. But if you read the book, you begin to see the ways in which I use this word, perhaps not in the way that, is the popular way of using it, but it worked for me as a tool, a methodological tool. And so that's basically how that happened. When I come to Babalo's question, again, quite challenging, and I may or may not be able to answer it. Look, I think, so if I remember, it's something to do with how I think of, what was it again? How I think about the script with, was it asexual? No, what was it? Sorry.
It was...
So my screen is not all up, so maybe let me do that. Then I can read the question as well.
Yes. Sorry, I've opened the wrong thing now also.
Okay. Oh yeah. Can we hear more about public script for women? Okay. So asexual good woman. That's quite a challenging question, isn't it? Partly because when you're thinking about other kinds of so the dominant position that I take is locating this book within a heteropatriarchy, right? And so a lot of the ideas that I generate are from that space. But as I say in my conclusion and my concluding chapters, this is a system. It's like a bigger system in which all sorts of bodies have to exist. And perhaps, and one of the things that I promise to do in my future is to open this conversation up so that it's so much more inclusive of all the people that are affected by this dominant institutional practices, if you want, which I know that I do not do very well with the book, because at the time I was chasing particular kinds of texts that map something specific that works within the kind of a dominant space where gender and sexuality, ideas around those are taken for granted. And so the short answer to that would be that all kinds of bodies become mapped in this big space that I talk about. Specific ways in which then this particular, if you want it, the ways in which this articulation happens in specific ways is something that I know that I probably don't get into. Anyway.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but Babalwa promised that Luando could ask the question. Luando, do you want to ask a question?
Good afternoon, good afternoon, professors. This is a very, very beautiful conversation, and it's very complex as well. But I'm still going to actually raise my question, particularly to you, Professor Gola. You spoke about the idea of feminism as something that is often understood as basically what you said is that all kinds of feminism, they actually vary. And they vary in a sense that not everything that has actually kind of transgressive can actually be located within the realm of feminism. And I just wanted to understand, what do you mean by that? Because I feel like you Professor Dina actually made an example to say that she lives in a very gentle, for example, gentle neighborhood that basically she can actually walk in those spaces, but she can't walk in those spaces because she's very much aware of what can possibly arise out of actually walking in those spaces. And often you find that women, the only response, or rather in most cases, the kind of response that can actually be given by women to the kind of spaces that are actually marked by patriarchy is a transgressive kind of response, which in most cases we can assume that there's the notion of feminism that actually comes with that, the standpoint where women actually are using the very same spaces to actually create a kind of alternate space where they can actually navigate themselves as well in it. Is a kind of feminism that it's something that we can actually associate to associate to feminism. So the question that I want to raise in this particular the question that I want to raise rather is, what do you mean by feminism that are actually kind of distinguishable, if I had you correctly, and saying that not all kinds of acts are actually associated to feminism.
I've got you. Okay.
Thank you.
So what I'm saying is there are, if we think about historically, if we think about what feminism is, or regardless of what kind of feminism it is, right? Because we recognize that there are many forms, and there are many strands and many whatevers. And there are disagreements that can happen within feminism, right? It's important that whatever the transgressive behavior that reads as, for something to be feminist, it has to be challenging of patriarchy, right? Of patriarchy at some level, patriarchal logic, patriarchal script, patriarchal, whatever. But what happens if, so that's the kind of historic understanding, and that's the understanding that I hold on to. But we also understand that it is possible to transgress boundaries in certain spaces, so to behave badly, to disobey rules of certain spaces in ways that do not necessarily question patriarchy. So you might be able to do, so I'm not talking about it in terms of being able to, so in a patriarchal society that says that public places are regulated in particular ways and women should not be able to, and part of how you terrorize women is by doing it in public spaces, to insist on walking is transgressive in feminist ways because it's disrupting the patriarchal script. Even so, you feel the fear, but you do it anyway. You're doing the thing that patriarchy says you can't. But let's say in other societies, let's say you live in a patriarchal society that says women need to cover up, right? And I'm not talking about Muslim societies, because Muslim societies always get blamed for all sorts of crazy things. But you live in a society that is not Muslim, but that says that a proper woman is a woman who covers up, right? Now, another way to transgress, so somebody could come along and say, okay, so I don't like this covering up of thing, and go off and strip someone else, right? Now, stripping someone is transgressive of the patriarchal rule of that society, but it is still a violent patriarchal act to strip someone, right? So now if we just reduce all feminist agency to the mere fact of transgressing the rules of a certain patriarchal space, then that violent stripping of someone in a society that says you should be dressed superficially gets labeled as feminist, right? And so because you're not paying attention to the structure, you're not paying attention to the fact that actually to strip someone is working within a patriarchal logic. It may not be the patriarchal logic that is foregrounded and celebrated immediately in that society, but it's a transgressive act. But not all transgressive acts are feminist. So that's what I'm talking about. That we need to do more than just say, okay, you're breaking a rule. You're a woman. You're breaking a rule. Therefore, a woman breaking a rule is doing feminist work. It's not actually true. But I mean, we're starting to see a lot of that kind of logic that, oh my goodness, she's a bad one. Yes, you're still a bad one for stripping someone, but you're not a bad one in ways that we can recognize. It's still a patriarch. You're still enacting patriarchal violence. You're just not enacting the patriarchal violence that is most fashionable in that society. And you're able to say that that person is doing feminist work if you don't pay attention to the structure, if you pay attention superficially to rule-broken feminism. So that's more what I was kind of talking about. So I've used that example, but I mean, there's many other examples that are perhaps more difficult. But Jupsi is on the screen basically to say that we must stop talking now. Thank you very much, Dina. Please get Dina's book. It's a wonderful book. You want to read it, no matter what kind of media you're dealing with, not just media. If you just want to understand if you want to understand how women become visible, historically in this moment, across literary, visual media text, trust me, this is the book you want to read. Buy the book, Google it, get it. If you Google it, if you just Google Ligaga and women visibility, and it pops up where you can find some of the places you can find it. My new book is Female Fear Factory. It's got that wonderful painting by Penny Siopis from her Shame series. So buy both our books. Thank you, Jupsi. Thank you so much, Dina. And we hope that in the new year, we can physically have you, not hope, we plan to physically have you to do some fabulous, exciting things with us in Gqeberha in the new year. Thank you. Yes, Professor Nomalanga Mkhize is saying one of the examples when women enforce actual rules, one sees a lot of this, I'm a badass feminist because you scream and insult people. Meanwhile, you're toxic to all the women around you. Then the women enforce actual rules of social order. It becomes, I'm being silenced. Thank you very much, Nomalanga. That's an excellent example. Part of the answer to you, Luando. Thank you, Jupsi. I'm going to shut up now. Thank you, Dina. I'm so excited.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you, profs. I think I speak for everyone that is inside the online digital room in saying that that was a very detailed, very thought-provoking conversation between these two books and how they intersect and some of the thoughts and how they're drawing parallels between the two books as well, theoretically and methodologically. Anyway, before we get excited, we still have more coming. And now I am going to introduce Mina Salami, who's going to be in conversation with Uzinhle, and they'll be talking about just having a conversation just like Prof. Ola and Prof. Ligaga just did. And Mina Salami is a Nigerian, Finnish and Swedish writer, feminist theorist and lecturer. She is the founder of the multiple award-winning blog called So I'm just having a bit of a, yes, okay, there you go. Award-winning blog, Miss Afropolitan, which connects feminism with contemporary culture from an Africa-centered perspective, and the author of Census Knowledge. Translates of Census Knowledge will be published by Schlitz and Soderströms in Finland, Planeta de Libros in Spain, Verlag and Mythos, and Seitz in Berlin in Germany. The book is also optioned by a Hollywood-based production company. Mina is a co-director of the feminist movement, Activate. She sits on the advisory board of the African Feminist Initiative at Pennsylvania State University and the editorial board of the Interdisciplinary Journal for the Study of Sahel. She is a judge of the One World Media Awards and a nominator for the Prince Claus Fund and the Princess of Austria's Foundation. In 2016, Mina joined Friends of the Earth to work as a lead author on the Big Ideas Project, which identified 30 big ideas to change the world. She holds a master's degree in gender studies with distinction, with a focus on Black feminisms from SOAS, University of London, and a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Lund in Sweden, as well as an honorary fellowship in writing from the Hong Kong Baptist University. Welcome, Mina.
Thank you, Yandisa. Thanks for the introduction.
Okay. Welcome. Let me now introduce Uzinhle. Uzinhle is a dual title PhD candidate in philosophy and women, gender and sexuality studies at the Pennsylvania State University. She specializes in critical philosophy of race, feminist philosophy, and existentialism. She completed her master's in philosophy at the University of Witwatersrand as a Mandela Rhodes Scholar in 2018 and Alan Gray Orbis Fellow. Some of her academic work is published in the Critical Philosophy of Race Journal, South African Journal of Philosophy, and Journal of World Philosophies. She's also a certified 200-hour yoga teacher and a mixed medium artist. Welcome, Zinhle.
Thanks, Yandisa.
Okay.
Hi, Mina. So good to see you. The last time when we met was in 2018 here at Penn State. So it's good to see you in the virtual world. So how I've thought of structuring the conversation is just to ask you a couple of questions that filled in, or at least allow you the opportunity to really just like discuss some of the things that you investigate in your book. And so I just find it interesting how, when we met originally, it was in the US where I am located at the moment. And I assume that you are located somewhere right now in Europe. And here we are meeting in a space where it's, located within South Africa, I guess, because this is like something that is held by Nelson Mandela University. And so we're moving between the different geographical cartographies. And these are cartographies that you move between from your Nigerian Finnish or Finnish Nigerian identity, whichever you decide comes first. And you've lived across the different continents, that is like Europe, North America, and even Africa itself. And so this is also just reflected in your citation politics in the book, where you move between North American and even European conceptions of Black feminist thought and even African feminist thought. And this is an approach that is very difficult to do, because it's a who do you prioritize, who don't you prioritize when you deciding who to side, but it's also a very appreciated approach. And so one of the starting questions is, I'm curious about how you identify or label, or the methodological approach you use is that of African-centered Black feminist. And so, you know, to somebody that might be like tautology, because what do you mean, aren't all Africans Black? So what does it mean to use the approach of African Black feminist approach in your book?
Wow, thank you. What a great question to start with. And I also just want to start by saying how wonderful it is to see you, if virtually. I absolutely recall our meeting in Pennsylvania and also our dancing, which is something that I miss very much in these times, just being out dancing with sisters and siblings. And I also want to say thank you to the Institute for Women and Gender Studies and to PUMLA for inviting me to this really wonderful space. It's such a delight to be here and contribute to something this important. And yes, thanks for the question. So Africa-centered Black feminist citing, methodology, bringing together in conversation. Well, that actually kind of speaks to what happened for me, which is that I didn't really think through it as a methodology intentionally, if you like. So, so much about writing this book, the part of my brain that was switched on was somewhat more the side of the brain that's maybe a little bit childlike. So it was very playful. I was wanting to, because I was presenting a kind of a new theory, which of course is rooted in a lot of existing Black and African feminist thought, but nevertheless, I wanted to approach it as if I were encountering it for the first time. And there's several reasons to why that was the specific book that I felt the need to write at that time. But it was all very intuitive. Listening to Pumla and Dina, I recognize so much, especially, in the conversation about how once you've written a book, you start to think not only that, oh, I could have added that, or I should have added that, but also I've found that I very much, retrospectively have been pondering, why did I decide to write the book in this way, in the same kind of manner of you asking this question. But I think that one thing that I was really drawn to in my unconscious, which of course is informed by a sense of urgency and like a deep care and a need to make feminist interventions and to make Pan-Africanist interventions and just really human interventions in a world that is in chaos. One thing that I was driven to do was to kind of bring modes of thinking and voices and people that have been so important to shaping my own thought into conversation. I think that I experience the world as one in which we are all kind of increasingly becoming isolationist and a little bit sort of separatist and insular. And of course, I was writing this book at a time when Donald Trump was in power and he was leading that kind of conversation. And I think I just really felt like, no, I don't want there to be distinctions between the voices that have shaped my worldview in such seminal ways. So that was a key driving factor in how I was using citations.
Cool. So just even speaking of the citation politics and how you come to knowledge, right? So the title of the book is Census Knowledge. And so I'm hoping you can expand more on just what you mean by census knowledge for people who haven't had the opportunity to read the text. Because when I first saw census knowledge, I thought, erotic, but then you quickly clarify that it's not limited only to the erotic, right? And so just even how you arrive to the definition of census knowledge, the approach that you take is an approach that I appreciate as somebody who's located within philosophy, even though the conversation that Prof. Dina and Prof. Pumla were having was shades of philosophers. I really just appreciated the approach that you have, where you depart from making a distinction between Western epistemology and Yoruba epistemology, right? So just starting the definition of what constitutes as knowledge from the Yoruba conception of epistemology, right? Which accounts for firsthand and secondhand knowledge experiences, but very much rooted in this empiricism, right? So it's just drawing from your lived experience, but also recognizing that your lived experience is important when you theorize from knowledge. And so I guess the question is, what is the aim or end of census knowledge? So who can occupy this epistemic position? Is it only limited to Black women? Because, you know, in the title, it's for Black women, or anyone can occupy this position of doing sensuous knowledge?
Yeah, so actually the title is a Black feminist, the subtitle rather, is a Black feminist approach for everyone. And that is truly the way that I envision sensuous knowledge being able to function. And a key reason for that is because I think one of the things that really drives me insane and makes me so angry is how like Black women's thought and Black feminist thought is not taken as a serious kind of intellectual contribution in the world. And so what this book is really, you know, one of the things that it's really trying to do at its core is to position Black feminist thought in the kind of, in the world of ideas and the scholarship around epistemology and ideas. And because I think, you know, in our time, so often when the notion Black feminism is mentioned, when those words are mentioned, there's a tendency to, I think, for many people to think of an individual Black feminist, or maybe a group of individuals, somebody like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie or Beyonce or whoever it might be. And even among Black feminists ourselves, and maybe, I don't know how much we want to, I do think that there are distinctions between Black and African feminisms, while there are also a lot of parallels. But even among ourselves, there's this tendency to think of the individual. And what I wanted to do in this book is position Black feminism as an ideological school of thought. So there is a thing, you know, there is an ideology that is Black feminism, and it has very specific points of view, which of course move and are fluid and fluctuate with time and with individuals. But there is a school of thought that we're drawing from, and it goes back, you know, if we're going to think really sort of specifically to the formation of the Black feminist organization in the 1970s, and already in their manifesto and their formulations and expressions of Black feminist thought, you know, there is this thing that we now call intersectionality, and there's the connecting of oppression and liberation with gender, race, and class, but also, you know, as I argue in the book, with a kind of embodied approach to knowledge, in which the more than human world and in which the arts and spirituality occupy a central position. And in a sense, it's, you know, so much has changed in these past 2 years because of the pandemic. And of course, I wrote the book before then, but already there was a sentiment of the changes that now have occurred, which is that more and more people in the mainstream are now sort of making these connections between the systems of oppression, as well as the kind of individual and collective approaches to liberation. And they are therefore, there's therefore a kind of even more of an urgency and a need for Black feminist thought in its ideological format. And that was what this book was saying, that, you know, there's no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to understanding how our world grapples with overlapping issues. Black feminist thought as a school of thought has been doing that for decades. So yes, but then at the same time, you know, alluding to in your first question, you mentioned how I come from multiple backgrounds. So I am indeed Nigerian and Finnish by heritage. I'm naturalized Swedish. I've lived in in New York, and now in London. So yes, I'm in Europe for soon 2 decades. And all of these experiences, among many others, have of course shaped my my epistemic worldviews. And so I was coming from a Black feminist tradition, which has given me so much as an African diasporan. You know, I think the first books that I connected with when it came to feminism actually were first by white feminists, because I lived in Sweden when I started calling myself a feminist. But then once I started to get a little bit fed up with those books, and I realized that I needed something that was also going to speak to myself as an African and as a person who by then in Sweden was racialized as Black. The thinkers that I encountered first were typically Black Americans, Angela Davis, bell hooks, Toni Morrison, people like that. But I had grown up in Nigeria, but you know, also in Yoruba land specifically. My heritage is Yoruba, and even though I don't speak Yoruba, the way that I see the world, the fabric of my cells is informed by a kind of Yoruba worldview. And so I certainly wanted to tie in that part of my being and the thing that has contributed to my sense of knowledge with this other thing, which was Black feminism. And then later in life, you know, my studies in African feminism and my engagement with the African feminist world, while also just, you know, insisting on being an intellectual and somebody who works in the ideas world. So, you know, going back to thinking about knowledge just universally. So yeah, there were multiple things and tasks going on.
So why did you decide on sensuous knowledge, right? So especially in particular, because it combines two epistemic frameworks, right? So there's I guess, sensuous, which is very much related to our senses, right? And for you argue that sensuous needs to also transcend that, right? And then there's the aspect of knowledge, which is quote unquote seen as like the thinking, very enlightenment. And so the approach seems to be combining, but also arguing for us to transcend that. And so I'm curious about the two combinations and what you think that offers African feminists or Black feminists or just feminist thought in general, right? Because as you say, you're not reinventing the wheel, but at the same time, you are at least contributing a different way of thinking about these concepts.
Yeah, thank you. I guess to address the last thing, I think what it offers to the feminist conversation is a kind of, you know, referring back again to Pumla's earlier point about naming, or maybe it was Dina, sorry. But yeah, it offers a kind of naming of praxis, of language that we already are performing or seeking at the very least. And also a deepening of that. And as I mentioned earlier, a synthesis of bringing voices into conversation that I hadn't seen in conversation as much as I would like to. The reason that the book title became Sensuous Knowledge was kind of spontaneous. So I was giving a talk at the Singularity University which is located at the NASA research camp in San Jose, so basically in Silicon Valley. And I was at the time working on an ideas book, or more like a pamphlet. And you know, as I said earlier, it's you know, I'm really interested in like big ideas. I think actually, you know, in the conversation earlier, Habermas was mentioned, and one of the things for me that is, I feel is, you know, a key part of the African feminist struggle and ideas coming from Africa is that that, as I said, like that they be taken seriously, but part of that, I think, involves claiming a kind of universal minded language in in our thought, not all the time necessarily, but that was what I wanted to do here. But anyway, I was at this event, a week-long event at the Singularity University, speaking about African feminism. And there I was surrounded by people who were thinking about big universal ideas that were typically progressive. So they were about things that could solve all kinds of crises that the world faces. And so I was really stimulated by the company. It was also because it's, based in California, in Los Angeles. No, I get it twisted now, whichever one is the state. It was, there was many elements that suit my kind of lifestyle. So the food was nourishing, and there were yoga and all of that kind of stuff. So there was one part of me that was really being spoken to in a stimulating and exciting way. And then on the other hand, I was also having, after the event, after the talks, we would go out for drinks and dinners, and you're having all these parallel conversations with people. And I remember being with a group of people having dinner one evening, and they started to speak about about life insurance. And basically it transpired during this conversation with this group of people who all were men and all were white and all were very privileged, that they all believed that they were going to live well into their hundreds. So until they were 150 plus, they were absolutely convinced of that if they didn't, if nothing unexpected occurred, then they would have the kind of technology of longevity to take them that far in life. And I mean, now I think those ideas are a bit more common, but this is, 5-6 years ago. And for me anyway, it was just shocking. And coming from a part of the world in which, the life expectancy is still quite low, well below the hundreds. There was just this immense dissonance for me between the ideas that these people who are truly going to shape our collective future, because this is Silicon Valley, so it's not just chatter. These are the actual shapers of ideas, and then their kind of blind spot and biases. And of course, this isn't the first time that I've found myself in that kind of environment. That's just like a kind of constant thing for Black women, as you know. But there was just something about that whole environment. And while I was there, this notion, sensuous knowledge, appeared in my mind. I don't know from where. I've never really thought of the word sensuous in any kind of serious way before. But I instantly knew that it was going to be the title of my book, because I'd been thinking that I did want to write a book. And so what happened was a little bit, it was like a backwards process. So I then went about kind of unpacking what this phrase meant. And this is how I've always written, like even with my blogs and my essays. I think it's somewhat unusual. Writers and academics, I think, maybe typically have like all the research and then think of a title, but I'm very much title first, and then I'm a bit like an archaeologist. I enjoy writing in that way, so I go searching for what that meant, and I found all kinds of different things along this journey. So Karl Marx used the phrase sensuous knowledge, for instance. So there was that like Marxist perspective on it. Of course, I encountered a lot of pornographic websites that use it. And then like capitalism. So there's like perfumes and stuff like that, that's called, that use that term. But the person who coined the term, John Milton, the poet, he coined sensuous precisely because he wanted to move away from sensual, which is to do with bodily pleasures, and instead find a word that could describe poetry, which was what he did. And so he coined sensuous to connote something that affects the mind, body, and soul, and not just one of them. And that is the definition that I like the most, and that I'm alluding to with sensuous knowledge. That it is a way of knowing and a way of approaching epistemology that is involving the mind, body, and spirit, if you like. And of course, that way of approaching epistemology is what I argue the Black feminist tradition has always done, insofar as it is a school of thought, because there are individual Black feminists who would not perform Black feminism or practice Black feminism that way. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So what does it mean then to, so for some people might argue that, a Black feminist framework is one that draws uniquely from, feminism. And so I'm curious, what does it mean to then, or at least to hear your thoughts on, do we then only draw from like, quote unquote, people who identify as women, or you can draw from anyone? Because, so drawing from like Milton, who I assume is a cishet man, and then picking and putting that together with the feminist framework, right? So what does that look like? Or do you not think that feminism is not only informed by people who are, I guess, like cisgendered, or even people who identify as women as the social construct?
I mean, regardless of what I think, feminism is certainly influenced by, people from all walks of life. The term feminism itself was coined by a white man, a French man. I don't really engage with John Milton. Actually, that's not true. I do, but not in terms of the word sensuous. In the chapter of beauty, I have a very critical take on how John Milton's work contributed to our, what I call Europatriarchal ideas of beauty. So yeah, I mention him, and he comes up a lot in my conversations about the book because he coined the term sensuous. But obviously, a lot of the language that we use, socialism, Marxism, a lot of these ideas were coined, and terms were coined by white men. And that's partly what this book is really trying to say, is that, that a small group of people have shaped the universal ideas that affect all of our lives. But I think that, so to directly to your point, I do see that there is a lot of feminism these days that takes a kind of blanket dismissal of the work of cis white men, let's say. I don't know if I think that is the most powerful way of resisting the dominance of such work. But what I want to do is really engage with that and like tear it apart, because I'm engaging with it. So and then present something different rather than like dismiss it completely. Because I also think that and I mentioned this in the book, while coining what I call Europatriarchal knowledge, that there's a difference between what I call Europatriarchal knowledge and what we might call Europatriarchal structures. So Europatriarchal structures are always oppressive. They're violent, they're dominating. But Europatriarchal knowledge sometimes has also contributed with ideas that can actually benefit us, and that we do, we seem to engage with. And so, yeah, it's. I feel like that's a more powerful way of actually positioning Black feminist thought in a way that it is taken seriously.
Yeah, and I also appreciate that clearly comes up in your uptake on beauty, right? And that we need to really just think about the aesthetic in different ways, in ways that are more powerful, I guess. And just, when I think of your approach in the chapter on beauty and even the chapter on power, well, actually, the whole book is very autobiographical. So, you as the author are never missing from the text. And, I think that is very clear of like very feminist praxis. But there's also something to be said about the autobiographical nature, right? So I was very, I guess the start of how you discuss the conversation on power and just the jarring descriptions on the pornography was very like insightful. And at the same time, you still grappling with these concepts. And so I'm curious to know why you decided to focus on, beauty, power, identity, those themes. And also if you were intentional in also making it autobiographical. Yeah.
Was I intentional in making it? Yeah, I think, I'm a blogger. I've been blogging for so long, and that kind of language, that methodology of blogging in which you are being autobiographical, and how that is, of course, connected to a kind of historical feminist way of writing, not exclusively, of course. Or what I mean is that feminists also write in ways which is not autobiographical, and I think that is important. But yes, it's just how I write, and I think it's important for the purposes of the type of reader that I imagine myself to be having a conversation with. So yes, and then the themes. I recently heard a talk with Zadie Smith, and she was talking about on beauty, and I'll borrow what she said to some extent. She has this novel called On Beauty or Of Beauty, and she said that she wrote that book, that it's a kind of, it belongs to like this canon of expansive English literature, classical English literature, that she had read growing up and as a student, but she'd never read that kind of novel with people like her as the characters and the protagonists. And she was driven to write a book like that she had spent her whole life reading with people like herself. And I heard that and I thought, yes, that is kind of what I was doing with Sensuous Knowledge. I'm a blogger, also an essayist, and of course a feminist researcher and writer. And but I read so many ideas books and essayists, and I've read the works of people like Francis Bacon and Montaigne and all these, essayists. And I wanted to, in some sense, I think I wanted to write that kind of book, but with the realities of Black African feminist experience at the center instead. But of course, in the book I talk about what I call writer's grievance, which is something that I experience like in lieu of writer's block, and which is a feeling that comes when you're trying to write about something that's universal or mundane or whatever it might be, but then the reality of racial discrimination, gender oppression, and all of these things just shows up on the page over and over again. And so, of course, that is something that happens and that I allowed to happen, because that was also the point of it. But in some like framing way of thinking of this book, it's an essay collection about universal concepts that happens to be written by someone who historically didn't see herself in those kinds of essay books.
Another universal concept is womanhood and sisterhood. And these are concepts that are not without problem, right? So for years, we know that even just the concept of woman was at the exclusion of Black women. And now the concept of sisterhood is at the exclusion of people who are not cisgendered. And even in your uptake of these concepts, right, is you highlight the problematic nature of them, but then continue that, you want us to really think of womanhood in different ways, right, that depart from, I guess, the Eurocentric concepts and uptake of these terms. And so, for example, in page 118, you say, for this reason, my understanding of womanhood is shaped by the mind and the passions, the intellect and the emotions, the felt, the lived, and the observed. It is an understanding informed by years of engaging with the literature of the topic in both the sciences and the humanities. It is equally an understanding that is deeply personal and thus unified through creative experience, political conceptualization, personal experiences, and that by that you mean sensuous knowledge. And then you continue on really just arguing for us to move away from the binary, but at the same time, you still remain within the binary. So I'm curious to know why you decided to stick with the concept of womanhood, knowing just how binary it is, and it's also at the exclusion of certain identities, and why we just not do away with the concept entirely.
Wow, yes. I think that what I'm striving for, so in a previous chapter before womanhood, the chapter about identity, I speak about, or I call for us to think about identity as a compass. So something that informs how we understand our lived experiences, but that is nevertheless not the same as our personas or our personalities, so something that we have a kind of loose relationship with. And that is really what that fluidity, and using the color blue as I do in that chapter, to rethink womanhood as something malleable. But I'm not arguing that it's not something that exists, or even that it's something that indeed we should do away with, which I wouldn't say that that's what I feel. In fact, I think that, we're at a very difficult juncture, if you like, because womanhood is, when you've grown up, into a notion like womanhood, or being a woman, and you've invested so much of your sense of self into that, and then you become a feminist, or some people are born feminist, whatever. At any point where those two things are meeting, that as a person who is conditioned as a woman, you have gone through this incredible conflict, and you've had to really come to a place of self-acceptance, which is forever changing, and like negative self-talk and a critical analysis of what it means to be a woman. And ultimately what that does, my point is that what that ultimately does is that there's a sense of belonging, I think, that word harbors for many of us. It does for me. So I don't want to do away with the word woman, but I don't want it to be defined by some Europatriarchal kind of machinery. And I also want to look at it philosophically and critically and understand that it is an invention, it is a social construct, but it does have this, it has several connotations, of course, but one which I think it has is a sense of belonging. And even if it didn't have it for me, it has it for, so many millions of women, and many of the women of whom I imagine to be my reader. And because I wrote this book, wanting it to have a kind of some kind of like psychoactive element. So it has that manifesto-like quality. I wanted it to be academically rigorous in a sense, but to also really speak to the lived experience of people who do identify as women. So I think to toss away with it, even if I can understand the kind of philosophical, ontological argument for that, but in lived experience, I think it's quite different.
Yeah, thank you for that. And making the distinctions between the ontological and the lived experience. I'm seeing the comment by Dr. Nomalanga Mkhize, and perhaps if, Dr. Nomalanga, if you can come in, because the question is very fragmented, or the comment is rather fragmented, if you can expand more. No? Okay, the answer is interesting. Okay, cool. So one other question that I had, without not trying to respond to the comment, was just even, I guess, what is the end of census knowledge, right? So what do we hope to do with census knowledge now that we have this theoretical framework? And how do you see that contributing to, I guess, the next directions and trends of feminist thought?
One thing is to have a contribution toward African feminist epistemologies, creating archives, as we're doing here over these past couple of days. I think, it's a book that is how should I say it? My hope is that it's a kind of pragmatic utopian manifesto of sorts. I think of myself actually in many ways as a pragmatic feminist. So it's certainly a book that's trying to envision utopias and, you know, find like glitches and places through which we can escape the Euro-patriarchal and the dominant ways of thinking. But at the same time, it's I want it to be something that is practical, so pragmatic in a sense. And I guess having an approach, because ultimately what sensuous knowledge is saying is that we cannot undo patriarchal systems using patriarchal thought. And so if patriarchal thought is about creating robotic, machine-like approaches to knowing, then by contrast, sensuous knowledge is about creating unifying ways of knowledge that is unifying, and that, you know, connects us individually, but also collectively and with the larger ecosystems in which we live. And so it's a kind of holistic approach. And yeah, so, you know, whether it's whichever issue we may be looking at, whether it's in our personal lives or in our collective movements, it is really trying to bring in that kind of holistic approach. And it sounds quite simple and obvious, but I in my encounters, I so often come across and myself have participated in spaces where we are not doing that. You know, we are still trying to create knowledge, still trying to be accepted into ways of thinking that are so much part of the problem. So for example, with, you know, power, it's something that is power is so important, of course, to feminist work, to Black liberation work. And we talk about it a lot, but yet I haven't come across, in my view, sufficient reimaginations of power and what it could mean. And so what happens is that we're talking about dismantling power, but we're still thinking about power in the way that Euro-patriarchal knowledge has defined it, as something synonymous with authority or dominance and violence even. And so the way that, you know, in my book, I reconceptualize power. I come up with what I call exusions as a different way of thinking about power. And that is informed by this kind of holistic, unifying approach. So it's a bit of a show, don't tell book, I think, in that sense. But the idea is to, and I say that, you know, not to like humble brag or something, but because I think, you know, the theory that I'm trying to evoke here is not one which is about formula, because that would go against the thing that it's criticizing, which is a machine-like formulaic way of knowledge. It's something that is informed by the poetic, by the body, by sensuality and eros and things like that. And so there isn't like a list by list way of practicing sensuous knowledge.
Thank you for that. So my last question, I guess, would be the combination of just the doing of the knowledge, right? And just drawing from how you arrive at drawing from Yoruba epistemology is also just connection with like personhood, right? And how this is also just about how we are.
It's 12 hours.
How we are persons existing in the world, and just like a framework that we ought to have, right? So just the combination of just personhood and even knowledge. Do you think that's like a fair reflection of how I understand this work doing?
So to an extent, but I would say what is crucial is that, you know, and the reason that I start the book with the Yoruba metaphysics about a kind of a way of looking at knowledge that is holistic, actually, in which what we in the West, in the English language, term like emotional intelligence and reason and separate between them in the West, but in Yoruba metaphysics, there's the myth and the philosophy that supports an integration of those things. And so, yes, personhood is very important. And the Yoruba worldview is, in many ways, it's a very stoic worldview, and it is very much about a kind of cultivation of personhood and of the individual mind. And I no doubt have imbibed that by living in that society. But it is also, of course, like all African metaphysics and philosophy, one which is very much about community. And that is really something that is, I think, to sum it up, what this book is resisting is not the individual, which I think is a very important concept that the West, we might say that the West has helped to really understand and develop and all of that, but rather individualism, which is a rampant disease that lies at the core of all of the multiple crises, from surveillance capitalism to social justice issues, and so drawing from that Yoruba ontology, along with my personal experiences, along with my background in African feminist advocacy and research of Black feminism, and my own like multi-perspectival worldviews, is ultimately to say that we need, that we have a crisis in relationship, and that has to do with a rampant individualism and a sense of community, not only in how we interact with each other, but also in how we produce knowledge. Like bringing that quality into knowledge production is something that is really essential, and that we need to think through more without like providing the formula for how we do that.
And added to that is also including the environment that we live in, right? So, you start the book on the mountain, and then you also round it off at the mountain as well, just to show how, I guess, just challenging this like very anthropocentric approach to even knowledge systems, and just showing how much we're also rooted in the environments that we find ourselves in. So I also appreciated just like the full circle, right? That we also just beings who also engage as well with the environment.
Yeah, it's so tricky because I was aware of not wanting to be anthropocentric, and yet in some sense, I think, it's inevitable when you start to theorize based on the more than human world. But yes, definitely bringing in that as well into the conversation of knowledge.
Yeah, that was my little way of saying, this seemed a little bit of anthropocentric, but then the approach was also just like a desire to move away from that. So thank you very much, Mina, for this gift that you've offered us. I think it offers a needed conversation in terms of the directions that feminist scholarship is going, whether it's African feminist, Black feminist scholarship, or just feminist scholarship just more broadly. And even the recognition of how, knowledge systems are not just informed by, I guess, like Western conceptions, but you find a nice way of merging African epistemology with both just like how epistemology is spoken about in the institutions that we find ourselves in. And also thank you very much to Prof. Pumla Dineo for organizing this space so that we can have this conversation. It's really always great to engage with the author and being able to ask the tough questions that you don't get from the text.
Thank you, Zinle. It's been such a good conversation.
Thank you to both of you. That was an increasingly great conversation. There is one question in the Q&A section, and is, where can we buy centrist knowledge in South Africa?
Oh, I wish I had a good answer to that. Professor Pumla has once shared on Instagram a photo which made me so delighted of my book in a bookstore in South Africa. So perhaps she can share what the name of that bookstore. Okay, somebody says loot.com. So
sure, I can answer that. Sorry, Mina. It actually is available. I mean, the book is available widely in South Africa, so you can get it through. It's in Exclusive Books. I bought several copies from Exclusive Books. I bought copies. It's in Loot. It's at Take a Lot. So it's actually yeah, you can get it from the chains and the online. They have it all on the databases. So it is available in South Africa.
Great.
Thank you, Mina. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thank you to both of you. Thank you, Zinhle. Thank you, Mina. This was a great conversation. I hope everyone has noted that you can get it from Takealot, loot.com, and Exclusive Books. And like Prof. Pumla has said, it is widely available across all bookstores in South Africa as well. Okay, thank you so much. I see comments coming in, everyone saying, wow, thank you so much, Mina and Zinhle. This was a great conversation. Prof. Nomalanga's just saying, I was actually just reflecting on yesterday's discussions on Wufazi and the structural and ontological makeup of Black African motherhood that can't be easily handled by analysis of binaries. So those are just some interesting comments coming in as we wrap up. Thank you to both of you. I really do think that was sort of you really put us through your thoughts and we collectively thought together. And that's always very exciting and interesting. Anyway, so now we are going to move on to our last conversation for the day, and that is going to happen between, of course, Usisi Mthunzikazi Mbungwana, who is a poet from Upper Indwana, Ala, Eastern Cape. She holds a master's in creative writing in isiXhosa poetry from Rhodes University, where she was a writer in residence and currently serves as a part-time teacher in the creative writing department. In 2020, she was part of the inaugural Sweden-South Africa Writers Fellowship Program, curated by the Gothenburg Literature House and Hear My Voice. She has performed at major poetry festivals, collaborated with theater practitioners, musicians, and her work has been published in journals and anthologies, including New Contrast, Home is Where the Mic Is, To Breathe Into Another Voice, a South African anthology of jazz poetry, Atlanta Review Journal, South African Women's Poetry, and Our Words, Our Worlds, writing on Black South African women's poets. And this is between 2008 and 2018. Her two books are Umnikelo and Unamwena. She writes in isiXhosa on themes of home, dreams, and everyday Black queer life. Welcome so much, Siswam, to the platform. And also, can I also just introduce Usisi Nwabisa, who's going to be in conversation, of course, with her. And Unwabisa is a social worker at Atlantic Fellows for Health Equity at Tikano, intersectional Pan-African feminist, social justice activist, a sexual reproductive health advocate, and women's rights activist specializing in HIV and AIDS, education, and gender-based violence training with a deep understanding of the South African context. Molweni, and welcome to the both of you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, over to you, Snabisa.
Thank you so much, Andisa, and thank you very much for this opportunity for me to be in this conversation with Mthunzikazi. And I just realized Mthunzikazi is actually Umkhaya Wam, because I come from Mount Fletcher, so I pass by Ekala when I go home. So Molo Mthunzikazi.
Molo sisi, ndiyavuya lapha. Thank you so much. Ndiyavuya uthetha nani. Yeah.
Enkosi kakhulu. So umbuzo wami wokuqala, Unamwena negama lakho lithi Mthunzikazi. Ngoku ndithathe mna xa ndiqala ukuyifunda le ncwadi, and I immediately thought of Psalms 23.
Yes.
And now your name is Mthunzikazi, and the title of your book is Unamwena. Is this deliberate? Is this coincidence? What happened here? Is this what you wanted us to see?
Thank you. That's a very interesting connection that I haven't made. That because I was raised by a lot of umakas bam no makulu. So Dani last born. So like with so much love from those women. So I've got like different names. It told me something like one like idea like that I won't say now. But yes, unamwena from Indumiso. Yes, I've got an influence in Methodist Church because my father was a senior preacher there. I was raised by my father, umama wayesebenza. So that influence, it has never left me. But I then twisted unamwena because this is a creative work. No matter how much you run away from the influences, they kind of like find you in a way, if you like. So unamwena ndimtwistile because here I'm talking about abantu abathanda nayo, and because you think Bible content, you think Christian content, and no, but I had that free will, to say unamwena, you are with me, So if we're not going to me, so that's fine. That is not what I was trying to do, but I knew it might go there. So hopefully, and then they can actually like see siyathandana and siyapha.
All right. Thank you very much for that explanation, because it got me thinking because when I opened it, I was like, oh, okay. And I read the first few poems. I was like, okay, this is not what I thought it was. And I found it very fascinating. And, when you open a book, you are trying to find yourself. You are trying to understand the world in someone else's perspective. You are trying to understand what is happening in someone else's mind. So, and then ukulele efama. So you are introducing me to the farm life. But before we go there, most of the time when we get imibongo poems in isiXhosa, written by Datumkai or Jolobe or Yako and all kinds of people, they would talk about religion, they would talk about rivers, mountains, flowers. I remember one poem that we did at school called Ukuzika Kukamendi. But you took a very, very different turn. You are introducing us to love, to intimacy, to pleasure. You are introducing us to sexual urges. You are basically just turning the tide, and it's very interesting. Is that what you wanted to do with this book?
Tell me. Of course. Because you see, the thing is, every writer, when they write, they write reflecting on the times that they are living in. So of course, Omkai and the others, they were writing and reflecting on the times that they were living in. So it would be disingenuous of me to write about, I care about imilambo, so I really don't have time and imilambo and all of those things, but they were important to them. But of course, you must also understand the history of imibhalo literature esiXhosa, that it comes from kufika kwa missionaries, and what we're supposed to write. And she's gonna kill me for this, but Unomalanga like really made things clear for me, and the many language to say isiXhosa say to the teacher sometimes a number of people who are writing isiXhosa or students who are writing isiXhosa, yes, and that reason is because sifuna ubhala ngesiXhosa sikude sibhekeleyo ebantwini, yabo, because if ndithetha nomtshanam ndithetha ngenye ibiba akazi understand uba yintoni loo nto. But also isiXhosa siya evolve, because social media and popular culture, they are ahead of us. And thina sifuna ukubuyela emva, and then ufike kube ngathi ubhala ufunda incwadi yeBhayibhile ungayi-understand uba yintoni imvaba. So I write the way ndithetha ngakhona, ndiyamixa xa ndithethayo naxa ndibhala ngolaa hlobo. That is how I do it. But also this was a personal project, you know. 95% of le ncwadi, it comes from thesis yam ye-masters. So Ndandi, I had an opportunity to come back to esikolweni after working for some time, 17 years to be exact, and then abuyela back up, and then I had to. It was an honest project, you know. It was a reflection moment, and I mean, if abanye bantu abaye bachubiseka yiyo, that is very good and well, but I had to be honest, you know. So I think the reason why isiXhosa abantu besibaleka is because sifuna sibe stagnant, as if ezinye izinto azimove, yabona. And sifuna uba stagnant, sizi-gatekeepers thina ezinobala ngathetha ngazo, but sizi-gatekeepers singayazi uba sicinezekile engqondweni, because that was the mission of missionaries. It is not ours. We have always been open, you know. We've always been free as abantu. We talk free, we talk freely, like ingoma eziculwayo zoleka sulala ngomqolo ebhedini, you know. Those are the songs that they do that, but when you come back to when you come back to isiXhosa, then ufuna ngokusisound like iBhayibhile. I don't prescribe in that way.
That's very interesting. So when we started this conversation earlier, Prof Gola uthi kum, she was very scared because ndikhulele eBasuthwini. So ngemvume yakho Mambatani, ndicela ukuthi Mambatani, ngemvume yakho ngicela ukufunda lo mbongo uku page 48 uthi unonga indoda.
Okay, ngosi.
Ingawufunda?
Ufunda ngumamni wena.
Ndingumangcitshane mna, ndingusichongoma.
Funda mangcitshane, siyabulela.
Unonga indoda. Unonga indoda akamntu, yinto, akayontombi, engengomfazi, engeyondoda, unonga indoda. Unonga indoda akazalwanga enje, uyazenzisa. Ukhethe ukuba yipota yokungciba oophayiphu bokuthutha ilindle, umsonto oxokonyezelelweyo wokuthunga amadlavu, irhonya elincangathi lokosula imigangatho. Unonga indoda ebuhlanta kangena akayondoda. Makasihlambe isidumbu sikayise, makayithenge inkomo yokubuyisa uyise, makamoluse ubunakwabo nabatshana, akayondoda. Unonga indoda eziko ebafazini akanasikhundla, akendanga, akanamntwana, akanandoda imthembise ngelobola, akanagoqo angaqhayisa ngalo, akanabhakipoti angabolekisa ngayo, akanazo neeplate angancedisa ngazo. Unonga indoda emsebenzini makangene ebusuku, makathuthe ezo bhokisi zisindayo, makavale amazibuko agqojozwa ngoomantshingilane, makavule iifolo ngamazinyo. Unamandla inkabi yenkomo engazaliyo, lidlolo. Unonga indoda ekukhuleni babemteketisa ngelikanonkwenkwana, bemqhitsa namathole, bemhlonta nangeentonga. Ngoku unonga ingayi, into engento, into ezenza indoda. Unonga indoda akamntu, yinto.
Wow.
Now,
thank you so much.
You are bringing us into the imagination of who Nonga Indoda is. And I think as a first point is Unonga Indoda ligama elinako ukuthukisa okanye elingavakalanga kamnandi. Ndiyafuna ukwazi ukubana why did you choose to use this word, even though most people might think could have used a better word or could have used something else. Why ukhethe ukusebenzisa igama lithi Unonga Indoda?
Oh, thank you so much. Like yeah, it's the first time I'm hearing someone reading that. That was special. Okay, let me gather myself. So when I was writing this, I wrote this poem, I think in 2019, during a period a master's a Rhodes. And I then heard of Prof. Umatebeni, iphepha lakhe but nongaindoda. I then read it later, which is very interesting because we were writing about the same thing but in different spaces, and we didn't have that conversation. And then xa ndifunda iphepha lakhe uthi yena uproblematizer i-gender, so lo unongayindoda wakhe umbeka in a positive way to say lo sisi lo amlandikileyo interviewleyo uthi yena xa uyalithandela kamunongayindoda because it makes it closer to utata wakhe. And from now growing up, it was one of those terms that, as you were saying, that was derogatory for me, and I remember even last year when I went home, because it's just the two of us who are still sister, my brother has kind of transitioned. So isn't was needs so there'll be these jokes about I just didn't like it. But now I wanted to highlight it, so ndisebenzisa apha iron, so that I wanted to highlight it so that ndiyazi for mna, and it was part of my disaster, but ndim lona, and then so that it doesn't trouble me so much when people say unongayindoda again. But I also wanted people to have a little bit of an understanding about what these names do to people and these name callings that we do to people, but also as speakers before now, and even no Prof. Golabit talking about we need to name certain things, So this is le masters ithetha ngoba izinto ezingenamagama ziduka nomoya, things without names, they get lost in the wind. So I think if once uqale uzifumane and say this for yourself, and then very later, aisaku affect as it used to, but also it will also help us to think, the way we interact with abantwana and how we break morality, how we break confidence, and all of these things.
Thank you so much for that, Tunze guys. So I was actually thinking as uteta about labels that are given specifically to women. I'm thinking apa ubala ngedlolo, which is a barren woman, a woman who cannot bear children. And I'm thinking of names like Idikazi, names like Inkazana, names like, there is in every situation, in every setting, there is a derogatory term that is used to describe a woman. But I think I like the approach that you are bringing, that if you also use it, you get to a point where it no longer affects you the same way it did. I remember at some point I was sharing how growing up, I was called Unomdagazan, which is someone who has dark skin. And it bothered me because it was not a compliment. It was not an acknowledgement. It was not anything, but it was basically meant to, make me feel some type of way. But I started calling myself Unomdagazan, and because I grew up in a Sotho-dominated area, my grandmother used to call me Mantu, and it no longer bothers me. So someone who says Nomdagazana to me, like yeah. So before we get very sad, so
let's not get sad.
Who is Nomanono?
Who is Manono? Nomanono is a fictional character, and a lot of people have asked me this. But as I say, I spent a year, just by myself and just writing. So there were things that I don't even know. There were scars, there were memories, there were happy things, there were not so happy things that I didn't even know that I had until I had that opportunity to actually just sit down and write. My family hasn't actually read this book, and I'm happy. Of course, musuku ezilalini ikhona phaa kwi-room divider, but abazoyifunda for now. That is good, because it was one of those things, that you just had to, do. So Manono, Manono, I don't know who's Manono. I think that's it.
Oh,
I don't know who Manono is.
But okay. No, I hear you. I actually hear you. You don't know Uman. It's okay. So back again, you are talking about love, intimacy, and pleasure, and sexuality, and also talking a lot about sex in the context of queers, queer people. And I love Unamwena. And unfortunately, for people who do not have the copy, I think, but most importantly, I feel like everybody should get Unamwena. Like, I don't remember carrying a copy of a book and just falling in love with it, because it is challenging me. It is challenging the way I see things, the way, the normalization, of how we were introduced to, everything. It's basically challenging the heteropatriarchal imagination that I have in my mind, because I think there's one of the poems that you write that I read close to 10 times, because I'm like, okay. So there is the Unamwena, there is stanza number 6. Uthi apha singxame okwayizolo, sidumbe siyachininika, simanzi asithonsisi siyagqizisa, sizintenqenteqe siqhingene, sikhululene, size ucho.
Yes, and actually, mna ndiyayithanda le ndlela ulifundela ngayo, like I mean, I think notahamba now, because mna ibingusize, as in like coming. And so ndiyakthanda xa uthi size, because of course when we're having sex at that particular moment kubili khona sabe sihambaze. So I like it. I actually like it. Yeah. So I think I'll read it like that. Yeah.
Oh, so when you meant the coming?
Yes, I meant like that moment where you can actually lick your lover's toes, because you are just about to come. So also lento bendiyizama apha, I read a lot of different literatures, of course, nezesiNgesi, but kuhlala kusithiwa esiXhoseni ayikho into ethile, kuhlala kuthiwa into esiXhoseni ayikho into ethile. So mna bendizama ukuza ne-erotica yesiXhosa. Because kaloku kulaa nto besithetha ngayo yokuqala missionaries bafuneka ibe apolitical, ibe asexual, ibe atheist. So here I was trying to say ikhona ngoku, because if I don't write ngale language yam ndisaphila, uDr. Mamgcina wathambile Masolo endisebenza naye said uba wandi-introducer kwenye i-poet yase-Ireland ebhala ngelanguage eseyiphela ngoku, I can't pronounce igama lakhe, yes-Gaelic. Uthi, I write in a language that might be dead while I'm still alive. So ndithi ke ngoku mna, if nam ndikhona and ndiyabona ndiyazifunda isiXhosa ndiyasazi, I mean isiNgesi sam sirayithi, ibona uba asikho kwi-ICU, asikho critical, si-right nje. But when it comes to expressing myself and being honest kum, ubhala kum kuyafana nendlela yokumeditate okanye yokuthandaza. Ndiyenza kakuhle loo nto, okanye ndiyenza ngokuqinisekileyo nakuzithemba ngesiXhosa.
All right. So when I was talking about the poem Umanono, and there is what I tried to understand what you were trying. And I think now that I have this opportunity to talk to you, I want you to tell me what is going on in your mind when you are narrating the story of Utamkhulu, the grandpa and the farmer of Fente. Uti apa kwesi stanza, amazinyo ethu axhaphe imivungulo yenyaniso. Yaziwa ndim nawe into esayibonayo. Imilenze katatomkhulu kumlomo weteletele kaFentere. Umlomo kaFentere kubudoda bukatatomkhulu. Iintsula zikaFentere ezirhiphilili buboya, udano lokuchitheka kobisi luka-Esther, ingxelo emfiliba emapoliseni, isithunzela esilila iinyembezi zikamakhulu, uthikoloshe ondicofa iimpundu. Now, this is where this really challenged my imagination. Now, we have been conditioned to think in a certain way. When we picture something that happened, I remember I loved reading when I grew up. And I said in the beginning that when we pick up a book, we're trying to find ourselves. We're trying to find the missing pieces of the puzzles. And I remember how I used to picture Lovedale, because, you know, most Xhosa books used to write a lot about Lovedale. And when I read Ingqumbo Yeminyanya, even though I had never been to Umbu and Solo and Mthatha, but I had an idea of what it looked like. Now here you are talking about imilenze katatomkhulu kumlomo weteletele kaFentere. You are saying utatomkhulu. And uti umlomo kaFentere kubudoda bukatatomkhulu. Now that I struggled to picture in my mind. Please take me through that.
Yeah, it's very difficult to analyze someone's poem, but also what was the poet thinking, you know, because as fund eskolweni or Jane Austen, once it fit with nonsense, or Jane Austen, you're like, what is the poet saying here? I'm like, I don't know. What you know more and was. Who knows, you know? But when I was writing at that point, I am telling of the things that we don't talk about, you know. Yeah. There's a lot of secrecy around the upbringing and the things that have happened, and how Apa lo Ufender is using the power yakhe to manipulate utatomkhulu, but then utatomkhulu akazukwazi uthetha ngayo, you know. So this is fellatio actually happening, like ngamadoda amabini la. So itsheletele katatom, because there are things, you know, like if we're talking about the penis, you know. So I was thinking about you know, and which is also my problem sometimes, because then later, because we are land, and all of these things. So but here I was talking about all of these secrets that we don't talk about, because if you are Quebec, I think we stand this land and as it inyaniso ixabe emqaleni kamakhulu. So these are the things that we don't talk about, you know, and it's around these secret things as core family, and this you know, this pricking silence, you know, because it's not quiet, you know, it's not quiet, it's not peaceful, you know. It is very volatile, but we don't talk about it at that particular moment. So that's what I was writing about.
That's interesting, because the poem Ameva, it basically talks up exactly about what you are talking about, that you are covering up your mother's secret, and your mother is covering up your grandmother's secret, and also your grandmother learned that from her grandmother that she needs to cover up. And you are directly and indirectly inheriting that secrecy. So for me, I find that very interesting, that, you know, everything that we do and everything that we know, we have learned from someone. And sometimes it is not a verbal, direct way that you need to do this or you don't have to do that, but by the way that you are looking at your mother doing things or your mother saying things, you learn that, okay, I am supposed to speak here and I'm not supposed to speak there. I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to do this. And usually we take a big interest on the role that is played by different institutions in our lives, like this, the home, the school, the religion, the law, the social media, and, you know, but we never really take into consideration the influence from books. Because I think what we learned more is the things that we learned at school, you know, the way we think, the way we perceive things, the way it shapes our imagination, the way it shapes our reasoning, it's based on the books that we have read. And so, okay, still on that note, so we talk a lot about representation.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually want to talk about your bravery, because even though we talk about representation, but in terms of music videos, in terms of, you know, what we see on the screen, what we see everywhere, even on the books, when we talk about queer people, there is still no representation. And for me to find a book that talks so explicitly about, you know, pleasure and, you know, about intimacy. But let me not talk about it. Let me invite you to talk about it. Is that what you wanted to do, that you were inviting us to say then? We have been talking about representation for a very long time, but we are not doing it. Is this what you wanted us to get?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very difficult question, but I'll try and babble on. So I don't wanna act here as a superhero, yeah, that's not what I was doing, you know. As I've said before, for me it was, I had an opportunity, you know, to reflect. You know, I had an opportunity for a year to just do that, you know, because I had to do all the other things before. So for me, 2019 was a good year for me to just sit and write, you know. So this is who I am, you know, this is who I am. I think if you check poem yoqala, it is Pili. So it's a mirror, it's a reflection. So I couldn't hide from myself, you know. And I was staying a res and res, you know, just this mirror, like every day actually, you know. I would like kind of poem and about phones John and there's born, it was a spirit slapping as a young, you know. So it was an opportunity to reflect. If there are people that find themselves in some of these poems, that would be very beautiful. That would be very beautiful. If there is a certain group or people who are in the LGBTI plus A plus Q community that find themselves, you know, that would be very, very. I think it will allow other people to write, you know. It will allow other people to. I don't want to say that this was about being brave. It was not about that. At that particular moment, like there were so many times when I was done writing it, you know, because you write the work and then you let it go. And then when I was putting it together, and I said this to Wad, I feel like I went a little bit deep here, you know. But by that time, you know, I couldn't go back, and I didn't want to do that, you know. But also my thing is always like in the creative aspect is like we always say we don't have this, we don't have that. Who's going to do that if we don't do it? Yeah.
Okay, so Yandisa says we have to wrap up in 2 minutes. So okay. I think also with your permission, that I like the conversation that is going on here, because it kind of portrays, or it paints this picture of how certain questions we do not have answers to, but people ask, but we don't have answers to, and also at the same time, not having these answers, but we do not know how to answer those questions. So I found it very, very, very interesting, but unfortunately, because of time, we have to wrap up. So I think I will ask the question that everybody might be thinking about, that where do we get to Unamwena?
Okay, so thank you so much for engaging with the work and also making me think more, you know, about certain decisions that I've made. In what and all the good stores actually, like bargain books, exclusives. But if I echo, because I published with Dr. Tambile Masol, So into banded pack yabona, and also ibena lanto ba si lilima labafazi sincedisene siyahlakula sisegadini. So iyafumaneka ko bargain books, iyafumaneka exclusives, but ke if awuyifumani ungaske nje ukuthumelela imessage singakwazi endinazo ziphelile kwangoku, but we are all on the second print, which is interesting because we actually struggled. Ngakumbi apha Eastern Cape ne bookstores, they were like, I know incwadi zesiXhosa ezabantu abadala, they are not selling. And we've actually kind of changed that, which is very interesting, so we also want to create that kind of a demand that people should go to the stores, and if you don't find it, ask for it so that they can order it.
Thank you so much, Mambatane. I am really, really humbled to have had this talk about this book. I think some of the questions that I still have, I would have to ask you.
As no goal. Ndingayithanda loo nto kakhulu. Enkosi kakhulu.
Okay. Back to you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Siyabulela kakhulu to the both of you. I believe there's so many things as Puma through this conversation. Yabona na chat section, there are fire emojis. People are saying, Prof. Nomalanga Mkhize is saying, please translate this to English, please, and stop being such a purist. Kutwa goosebumps, valid highlight, and also just a highlight from Prof. Ola that says, izinto ezingenamagama ziduka nomoya. And I think there is power in naming things, and I love what you said about that, and reclaiming things and taking the very same names that were meant to be derogatory, and create meaning for ourselves in our day and in our time. And I don't know, goosebumps and but in Ngolo Hlobo, I do want to invite Prof. Ola to come and just summarize everything up and do justice in Ukubulela, and just saying thank you to everyone who participated today. Thank you.
Thank you, Yandisa. My goodness. Okay, so we are at the end of our first incarnation of African Feminist Book Worlds. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to everything I'm going to be saying on behalf of myself, and on behalf of myself and the director of the Center for Women and Gender Studies. So I'll be speaking, so this is all a vote of thanks from the Center for Women and Gender Studies and the chair in African Feminist Imagination, which is part of that. We are incredibly fortunate to have such amazing support at this institution from the highest offices in our institution, and to have the top leadership also in attendance of these sessions. So the Vice Chancellor, Professor Mutwa, was with us yesterday, so we thank her and for her support. The DVC for institutional support, Lebogang Hashadze is still here. Thank you very much for all of your support and for being here with us. The Deputy Dean of Humanities, Professor J.K. Luke, is here. Thank you so much for being here yesterday and today, as well as the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Maseko. We see in the attendees many of our friends and collaborators from different institutions, the CEO of the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, the incomparable Professor Sarah Muswetsa. Thank you for joining us. We see also our collaborators, the chair in genders, sexualities, genders, and queer studies at the University of Fort Hare, Professor Matebeni, Dr. Spoka Zimagaza, one of our partners at Rhodes, from Rhodes, Politics and International Relations, Dr. Atambile Masola from Historical Studies at the University of Cape Town, Professor Nomalanga Mkize, who is a colleague in the Faculty of Humanities, but whom we sometimes like to think of as a kind of honorary member of the Center for Women and Gender Studies. We are delighted to see our friends from other institutions. Professor Pat McFadden, we are welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Professor Helene Strauss, our great friend, Professor Grace Musila, and Professor Linda Gichanda Spencer. We could not have had this event without the incredible authors and interlocutors who formed the very heart of this event. Lihle Ngobozi, the author of Mothers of the Nation, Manyana Women in South Africa. The editors, Professor Desiree Lewis and Professor Habiba Badarun, the editors of the collection Surfacing on Being Black and Feminist in South Africa, who were in conversation with Gail Smith, whom we also were delighted to have. Dr. Atambile Masola, author of Ilifa, and her fantastic interlocutor, Aphiwe Ntlemeza, who is a member of the chair. We are also, of course, still listing the incredible authors who have agreed to form part of this lineup. The amazing Dr. Dina Ligaga, whose book I'm obsessed with, author of most recently of Women, Visibility and Morality in Kenyan Popular Media. The, again, incomparable, amazing Mina Salami, author of Sensuous Knowledge, a Black feminist approach for everyone, who many fans across the world also know, not just for her incredible essays, but for her phenomenal, institutional, beautiful site, Ms. Afropolitan, which was a blog and is now a website, which for many years was a place and a site of sustenance and joy and pleasure and intellectual invigoration for African feminists of different generations from across the world. The scintillating Unamwena, written by Tunzikazi Mbungwana, who, sorry, I think I often call you Mbungwana, who was in conversation with the wonderful Nwabi Sajova. Thank you, everybody, so very much. And thank you, of course, to the people who held the program together, who are the assistants and members of the Center for Women and Gender Studies, Yandisa Jubase and Nomta Menye, and Spogazi Tau and Wendy Adams, without whom we couldn't have any of these hosting these wonderful events online so successfully and so seamlessly. The African Feminist Book World is the first of an annual series of reflections on and engagements with sites of African feminist theorization, pleasure, conceptual generation, imagination. We are delighted that this first incarnation proceeded so beautifully and so joyfully. We thank you for your time. We thank you for your questions. We thank you for your support. Thank you, Lee Walters, for your wonderful questions and for showing up on both days. Thank you for all of your participation in the comments. We hope to see you in person in now that everybody's been vaccinated, and hopefully we won't all have to get too many boosters in the new year. We hope to see you again in what we plan to have as an annual part of our annual calendar at the Center for Women and Gender Studies and the chair in African Feminist Imagination, which we hope to have in person and not simply online, as part of our absolute, unapologetic, and consistent commitment to engaging with and mapping and charting and amplifying the worlds, the imaginations, the legacies, the theoretical, deep theoretical traditions of African feminists in the world, because we do believe firmly that African feminist work, that African feminist words create new worlds. Thank you. Have a good evening and take care of yourselves. We'll see you again soon.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.